Thanks, everyone, for sticking it out until the very end of the conference to hear our talk, BECs and Beyond, Investigating and Defending Office 365. So through the course of the talk, we're going to go over Office 365 in practice. So we're going to talk about some of the key components of Office 365 authentication, as well as the different logging mechanisms that as defenders, as responders, we need to know about so that we can actually effectively investigate breaches of Office 365. We'll take that knowledge and apply it to two different case studies. One of them, a business email compromise, which is one of the more prolific attacks affecting Office 365. And then we'll go into a more advanced attack that we see nation-state actors applying and targeting in Office 365. And at the end, we'll have some bonus time to talk about a couple of different features that didn't really fit into these case studies. And by the end, we should have a few minutes for any questions. So first, my name is Doug Beanstalk. I'm a principal consultant here at Mandiant. I've been with the company for 5 years now. I'm an incident response and red team leader, splitting my time pretty much evenly between those two different activities. And over the 2 years, I've become an Office 365 connoisseur. I've developed a very strong love but also hate relationship with Office 365.
I'm Josh Madeley. I'm a principal consultant. I've been with Mandiant for about 4 years now, and I'm based out of our Boston office. And over the past couple of years, I've also become a bit of an Office 365 connoisseur. And you may detect this throughout the talk. It's turning into me becoming a bit of a curmudgeon, but I do love working with these cases and dealing with these types of intrusions.
So Office 365 in practice. By show of hands, how many people are in an environment or utilize Office 365? So just about everyone at this point. Microsoft is winning the battle here. So when we think about Office 365, a lot of us think about just email, when in fact, Office 365 is actually a suite of applications. And on the slide here, we can see about the 35 different applications that encompass Office 365. Now, we do have Exchange Online, which is just a bunch of Exchange servers sitting in the Microsoft cloud. And we also have Identity, which is going to be backed by Azure Active Directory, which is, again, just Active Directory, domain controllers, all of those different servers in the Azure cloud. So when we talk about authentication, we need to consider where authentication is happening and also how authentication is happening. So the where can fall into two general buckets. The first being cloud authentication. And this is what Microsoft recommends all organizations move towards, cloud authentication. The actual decision of authentication is happening inside Azure Active Directory. It's very simple and easy to maintain. It has quite a lot of different features. In fact, in order to actually get some of those advanced features that Microsoft touts, like identity protection and password protection, you actually need to use cloud authentication. Our second solution is federated authentication. And this is what we see a lot of large organizations use. It offloads the authentication decision to a third party, a trusted third party. This could be on-premise with Active Directory federated services. This could be Okta. This could be Ping. There are a lot of different options. Now, in theory, this gives you more control over the authentication, and you have a lot of different options depending on the third party you use. But it is, of course, more difficult to implement and more costly to maintain. Now, when we're talking about how authentication can occur, we have two options as well. The first option is modern authentication, and this is the standard and recommended sign-in mechanism for all modern web clients and all Office clients. Behind the scenes, we're going to be using OAuth bearer tokens to actually do the authentication and maintain that authentication state. And it supports advanced security features that you would consider common nowadays. Multi-factor authentication, conditional access policies, where you can take metadata about the authentication event, like the geolocation of your user, and make a decision based on that. Now, our second type of authentication is legacy authentication. This is enabled by default, and it's very important to remember that. And it can be used with several different protocols, POP, IMAP, Exchange Web Services, and all it is it's really just HTTP basic auth. So you send a username, password, along with each and every HTTP request. Now, why this is important is because, one, it's enabled by default, and two, it does not support the advanced security features that modern auth does, most notably multi-factor authentication.
So we've talked a little bit about how the authentications occur and where they occur, but now we need to know where they're recorded and how we as defenders can determine what actions were taken by an unauthorized actor in an environment. So there's three main log sources that are going to be used during investigations. You have the unified audit log, and as its name suggests, it is the centralized logging repository. You have the mailbox audit log, which records access to objects stored within a mailbox. And then you have the admin audit log, and that's going to record administrative actions and the corresponding parameters that were supplied with them. And then sometimes, depending on the type of environment that you have, if you're an Azure Active Directory Premium subscriber, you'll have access to the Azure AD audit logs, and that's going to provide rich data about how authentications occurred, what conditional access policies were applied to a particular authentication. And then additionally, as responders, we want to look at mail trace logs, knowing information about the SMTP headers of mail coming into and out of the tenant. And then there's the security and compliance reports that allow us to search through the content of messages within a tenant. And as we'll later see, APT35 has leveraged this with great success to steal data from large organizations. What we're not going to talk about today is the Activities API. This is an undocumented performance monitoring API that has been relevant for Office 365 investigations in the past, but it is no longer accessible. Microsoft doesn't want people using it. It's unreliable. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you do need to access that log, you'll need to make a support request through Microsoft. So the Unified Audit Log is a centralized service within Office 365 that the various components and applications use to centralize their logs. So SharePoint will send logs to the Unified Audit Log, Exchange will do so, OneDrive, et cetera. And they're stored in JSON, and they're searchable via a PowerShell command to search Unified Audit Log. It's also accessible via the web user interface, but it's very difficult to export data from that and search it effectively. But you have the option to search for data by username, IP address, the operation or event type, as well as some plain text searching capabilities. But when you do make queries, you're limited to 5,000 results at a time. And this becomes problematic in large environments with 100,000 users, and you're trying to identify all the authentications that occurred in the last 30 days. You end up hitting those limits very quickly, so it's generally recommended that you integrate your SIM with these logs so you're not beholden to the PowerShell commands. Another thing to note is that there is a hard cap at 3,060 characters for these records, and not all of the services that send logs to the Unified Audit Log respect that limit. And we'll see that, how important that is a little bit later, but it does result in truncated event log entries. So if you have parsers that you've written or you're trying to put the data in, say, Logstash or Splunk or something like that, you may be dropping relevant events due to malformed JSON. Within the last 18 months, Microsoft enforced a hard cap of 90 days for storage of these logs. They used to be available for many years, but as they were starting to push clients to enable audit logging to help them investigate intrusions, they're running into space constraints, so they've now mandated that 90 days is the cutoff. It's also worth noting that these event log entries are not going to be available immediately after the event occurs. So if you're thinking about doing real-time monitoring, you may have to wait up to 24 hours for an event to show up in the Unified Audit Log. So when we look at an individual entry, we're going to get the creation time, when the event occurred, and we're also going to get an identifier. Unfortunately, this identifier is not a session ID. It cannot be used to tie multiple event logs together. It's just a unique identifier for that event. You're going to get the operation, which tells us what action occurred. Could be a user logging in, could be the creation of an inbox rule, the workload that generated this. This could be Azure Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, the user ID that performed the operation, and the client IP address that they came from. Now, most of the applications within Office 365 record a client IP. Exchange records a client IP address. So while you're going through these logs and you're only looking for client IP, you may be missing critical data. There's also other event log entries that we'll look at later that don't record an IP address at all. So some of the useful event logs that we see are user logged in, which lets us know that a user logged into Office 365. This does not mean they logged into Exchange. It just means they logged into the tenant, the suite of software. Then new inbox rule or set inbox rule. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but they will let us know about the creation of rules. Maybe we're hiding messages coming from the attacker or from business partners that we don't want to be found. And then there's also OneDrive events that record file accessed events. Quick note about the file accessed events. They don't necessarily mean that the contents of the file were accessed. That access can be programmatic in the generation of thumbnails in the splash screen of the portal, and it generally means that at least the metadata of that file was accessed. So moving into the mailbox audit logging, these are going to be logs that are related to interactions with objects inside the mailbox itself. The log is going to be stored inside a hidden folder within a mailbox. It's not accessible through any sort of GUI or anything like that. You have to access it through the command, the PowerShell commands. And what's important to note about that, it means that they're not centrally indexed. So you can't search, you can't in parallel search all of the mailbox audit logs. You have to identify a particular mailbox that you're interested in and look at the audit logs. They can be retained for a long period of time, and they use up the size or the amount of storage space assigned to that mailbox. So your only limit is the 99 gigabytes assigned to your mailbox. Now, when a user interacts with an object inside of a mailbox, the type of logs that are recorded are going to be dependent on how that user authenticated to the mailbox. So if you have an administrator user trying to access a message, you're going to get something like a message bind event being recorded. So this lets you know that an administrator user used administrative creds to view a message. Now, if that same message is viewed by an executive assistant using their delegate permissions, you're not going to see that message bind event. You're only going to get a folder bind event. And if you log in with valid credentials, neither a folder bind nor a message bind event are going to be recorded. And this is really important because when you're thinking about a compromised mailbox, the first question is, what data was looked at? What data was exposed to the attacker? I mean, unfortunately, this log cannot provide that. Microsoft did earlier this year try to implement message auditing for owner access, but it had a major performance impact across the globe, and they had to roll it back pretty quickly. And the last log that we're going to talk about here in detail is the admin audit logs. And these are going to record actions taken by the administrators based on Exchange online PowerShell commandlets. And if you've noticed the web UI of Office 365, some of the errors that show up, you'll note that most of the admin interfaces are just wrappers for PowerShell commandlets. So this data is returned to you as a PowerShell object that, using the latest version of PowerShell, you can trivially convert to JSON. It's retained for 90 days. And the majority of the events are going to be forwarded to the unified audit log, so you don't necessarily have to go and seek these logs out independently. But they do, in some instances, contain more granular information about the parameters that were passed to a particular command. So in some instances, they are useful to look at.
Okay. So now we've become Office 365 experts in the last 15 minutes, give or take. We're going to work into our case studies. And the first is business email compromise. So business email compromise can be broadly defined as a type of fraud where an attacker gains access to the mailbox of someone who can control company finances. Now, we don't mean the CFO necessarily, just someone in your Treasury department who can execute a wire transfer. Now, the attacker is going to use that access to trick that individual or to trick other individuals at the company into moving money into an attacker-controlled bank account. And this is such a prolific attack, such a big problem. The FBI estimates that over the past few years, it's cost US companies over $12 billion. Now, because this is fraud, there's always going to be some mechanism of deception going on. And it can vary from case to case. But in general, we see a trend where we have two different types of impersonation. We have CEO or CFO impersonation, so the attacker gains access to the CFO's mailbox or just to maybe someone in the Treasury Department's mailbox, and they pretend to be the CFO and say, hey, we're about to acquire this company. I need you to wire $500,000 to this bank account urgently, and it's a secret, by the way. Another form that we see is vendor impersonation. where the attacker finds out that your company works with a vendor, Acme Corporation. The vendor gets in the middle of that communication and they say, hey, actually, our bank account has changed. Can you please forward all future payments to this bank account instead? Now, all these attackers, they tend to follow a set playbook that we'll walk through now. The first thing the attacker needs to do, of course, is gain access to a mailbox. And we can see a real phishing email from a case that we've recently investigated. The attacker has changed their email display name to Human Resources. That gets our attention immediately, right? And they say, oh, Brian, you know, there's this document here. Please review it and make the changes that you need. Now, it's actually not an attachment. It's just an image with a hyperlink to the page that we see on the other side of the screen, which is an exact copy of the Microsoft Office 365 cloud sign-in page. The only thing that would clue you in that this was a phish, besides the email, would be that the domain name is not going to be a Microsoft domain name. Other than that, they have managed to pretty much perfectly copy the Office 365 sign-in page. So as defenders, we want to find out information about this phishing email. Where did it come from? What are some of the other SMTP header details? And we can use the mail trace log. Specifically, we can search the mail trace log using PowerShell, using the start historical search commandlet. We can search for all the messages that joe@victim.org received over the past 90 days. Now, if you're doing this in practice, you just need to be aware that the search can take several hours to complete. It's one of the slower searches in Office 365. But when we get it back, we have this nice CSV format. And as investigators, we're probably most interested in the original client IP header. And this tells us what SMTP recorded as the sender's true IP address. So we want to probably plug that in and do some searches to see if it shows up anywhere else, maybe give that to law enforcement, etc. Now, the attacker, of course, is going to use those credentials to log in. And so we want to search the unified audit log to see everything the attacker did using Joe's account. And we can do that with the search unified audit log commandlet, searching 90 days for any operation where Joe's user ID shows up. And we get a really lovely JSON record that tells us lots of information about the authentication. Though there's a couple of ways that we can be fooled, and we need to make sure we understand them. The first would be the result status succeeded attribute. It might be a little hard to see if you're in the back, but I think we can all agree that user logged in, result status succeeded, should mean that the authentication succeeded. It says it right there. Well, it turns out that Microsoft wanted to make things a little more challenging for us, and you have to continue reading that record to see if there's a logon error attribute. Now, in this case, we see there is a logon error, and we see that it says client or strong off and client off and required interrupt, which after a Google will tell us that it means the authentication actually failed because the multi-factor authentication requirement did not pass. Now, we also are going to pay attention to two additional attributes, the target ID and the application ID. Now, in the JSON record, those are just recorded as GUIDs, just strings of numbers and letters seemingly at random. If we take a quick sidetrack into Azure, we can actually understand what those GUIDs are, and it's really useful to us as defenders. So we're in Azure, which is just Microsoft's cloud. All of Office 365 resides inside of Azure, right? Why not? Now, everything in Office 365 is an application, which has an application object. So when you create an application, there's it sits somewhere in Azure, and even Microsoft follows this model. So Exchange Online is an Office 365 application which sits inside of Azure, specifically in Microsoft's own tenant, or their own environment. Microsoft Services, I think, is the name. Now, any other customer that wants to use that application is going to create a local copy of it called a service principal. So just about all of us are probably using email for Office 365, which means all of our tenants should have a service principal for Exchange Online. That service principal has a unique ID, or a GUID, which is then recorded in the unified audit log. So using some PowerShell, we can actually pull down a list of all these service principals and their corresponding IDs, and then we can map it back to those JSON records. So this JSON record actually tells us that the attacker tried to log in. They were using Microsoft Office, and they were trying to access Exchange Online. So they were probably using Microsoft Outlook. Now, this is also really important because we need to understand that there's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping in the event log of logon events and actual actions taken by the attacker. Because if we think about the application model of Office 365, each application needs to be uniquely authenticated to. So SharePoint, you need to authenticate to. Exchange, you need to authenticate to. Skype for Business, you authenticate to. Now, as an end user, that's invisible to us because of the magic of OAuth. But in the unified audit log, we're going to see that. So for example, when you log into portal.office.com, which is kind of like the Office 365 homepage, it's got some email detail for you, it's got some SharePoint detail for you, it's got some Skype for Business detail for you. To get that information for you, an authentication event occurs. So if you're looking in the unified audit log, you may see 6 or more user logged in events within 1 minute of each other. And all this is telling us as defenders is that, well, the attacker probably logged into some sort of web portal that required a lot of different applications to do its job. And by mapping those target ID and application IDs, we can start to get an idea of what happens. On my public GitHub, I have a listing of all these application names and their IDs. There still are some that are unknown to me, so if anyone knows them or if anyone works at Microsoft in the audience, feel free to fill them in. Getting back on track to our case study, we need to think about legacy authentication now. So we already mentioned that legacy authentication, it's older, it bypasses MFA, and in fact, we see attackers use this a lot because a lot of organizations may not be aware that they still have this enabled. And in this event, our clue was the user agent string of Exchange Services Client. A quick Google search showed us that this was a EWS client library available on GitHub, and it allows programmatic access to a mailbox, and because it's legacy authentication, we're bypassing that MFA requirement. Now finally, the attacker is in their mailbox. They're going to do some searches, right? They're going to search for terms like wire transfer, money, payment, and start to get an idea of how money actually flows in this organization. Now, unfortunately, as defenders and investigators, there's no log entry that tells us whenever someone searches in OWA or Outlook. We're sort of in the dark for this phase, but we can generally assume this is what the attacker will do. And before they actually execute their wire fraud, they want to make sure they take steps to hide within that mailbox. And they'll do this through inbox rules. So the first inbox rule that we usually see them create is attempting to hide any evidence that they've been detected. So, maybe your neighbor in the accounting department will email you and say, hey, I think you've been hacked, or, hey, I think this is a phishing message. The attacker will create inbox rules to match any messages with those strings and move them to the trash. Now, the second thing the attacker is going to want to do is they're going to want to hide any attempts where their fraud could actually get revealed. So, for example, the attacker, they are impersonating the Acme Corporation, and they are now receiving Acme Corporation's payments. Well, eventually, the real Acme Corporation is probably going to start wondering why they're not getting paid, and they're going to email this person to ask, why aren't we getting paid? So the attacker will create a rule to simply move any messages from the real Acme Corporation into the trash, or we've also seen into hidden folders like the RSS subscriptions folder, probably in an attempt to sort of get around any smart defenders out there who are looking for inbox rules, moving things to the trash. And then finally, if we're investigating, we need to know how to actually pull out these inbox rules. So we can actually do this pretty simply using the search unified audit log commandlet, and we're after 2 different operations, new inbox rule and set inbox rule. Now there's a couple of nuances to be aware of. The first is for set inbox rule, which happens whenever an inbox rule that already exists is modified. So we can see on the left-hand side of the screen one of these events. We can see that a particular condition was modified. So this rule was changed, so it now matches any message from Acme, acme.com, or Lena. What we can't see is we can't see the rest of the rule. All we have is this identity value, which unfortunately as defenders is useless to us. There's no way we can search this within Office 365. It maps to something on the back end, but we actually can't see what rule was modified. The other thing to pay attention to for both events is the IP address. It's got some extra numbers scribbled onto the end of it, which is actually the client's ephemeral port when they established a connection to Office 365. Now, it used to be that this port meant that searching for this particular IP address would leave out all of these events, because searching in Office 365 used to be an exact string match. And even doing that free text search, so just searching all of the text of the event log message, it used to leave these events out. Happy to say that finally Microsoft has fixed this issue, and now within the last month or so, if you search for an IP address, you'll get back every single event that you would expect to get back. So it's good news for us as defenders. Now, the last thing to do, of course, is affect that wire transfer. So the attacker will register generally a typo-squatted domain. So if Acme Corp is acme.com, they may register acrne.com because it looks pretty close to acme.com if you're not paying a lot of attention. Then they'll just reply all to a thread that they found in the victim mailbox. And they'll say, usually what you see up here, hello, please change the wire destination to this new bank account. Our current bank account is broken, I don't know. And please pay us right away and let us know. And we've even seen cases where victim organizations have responded and they've said, well, this is all well and good, but we actually have this piece of paperwork you need to fill out for a bank account change. And in lots of cases, the attackers say, okay, that's no problem. They fill out the paperwork, they send it back, and then they get paid. So before we move on, I just want to point out one important fact, and that's if your organization is ever the victim of BEC, or if you have ever executed a fraudulent wire transfer, you should contact the FBI immediately. Within 24 hours, the FBI and the partners in banking, they are very successful at getting at least some, if not all of your money back. However, after 24 hours, that success rate drops precipitously. So it's really crucial that as soon as you identify this, that you contact your law enforcement, and they'll be able to work with you to try and get that money back.
So we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to talk about how APT 35 leverages Office 365 to steal large amounts of data from organizations without leaving a lot of artifacts on the host within the environment. So we're going to go through the high-level part of the attack, or the high-level summary of the attack, is that they password sprayed an ADFS proxy to identify valid credentials. They then used these valid credentials to access a single-factor VPN, move laterally within the network to identify the exchange administrator's credentials, and then use the e-discovery functionality within Office 365 to steal large volumes of data from the environment. And then to maintain a level of persistence to the data they were interested in, they assigned delegation rights to the accounts that they had compromised to high-level people within the company. So a password spray is when an attacker picks a handful of passwords that are commonly used and tries to use them across every single account. Summer 2017 comes to mind pretty regularly. Now, because ADFS servers sit inside your network, failed authentications are not forwarded to Office 365. So the unified audit logs are not going to know about these password sprays. What that also means is that the protections that Microsoft has for password sprays with the cloud authentication model that they offer will not be applied to these attacks. The next important part that you need to know is that these logs are going to be stored in your security event log on the ADFS server, and they roll quickly. So you need to be sending them to your SIM of choice if you want to retain them for any meaningful period of time. And if you don't have advanced auditing enabled, the client IP address from the request will not be recorded. So on the right here, we have what the failed authentication attempts look like, and you would sometimes see hundreds of thousands of these in the event logs over the course of a couple months while they're trying to get passwords without locking out accounts. And then on the left, we see what the successful authentication looks like. This very handy string, foreign realm index logon initial auth using ADFS federated token. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it does explain what it is. There was a successful token exchange between the ADFS server on-premise to the cloud, which authenticated the user. We haven't seen this event ID show up a lot in investigations lately, and it's mostly because Microsoft is using the user logged in event for authentications, but it's still something to keep an eye out for. So this particular client was being clever, and they were using conditional access policies to restrict logins from non-US based IP addresses. Effectively meant that you had to either be on the corporate network, VPN, or within the US to access Office 365. So what we started seeing was the initial sign-in by the attacker occurred from a US-based IP address, which was a virtual server provider. Then all the subsequent logins were recorded from another IP address located in the Netherlands. And we later learned that when the access tokens are refreshed, a user logged in event is recorded, but the token refreshes do not get the conditional access policies applied to them. So that the conditional access policies are only applied on the initial authentication. And this makes perfect sense. When you're logging into your phone, you don't want to be prompted for a multi-factor authentication every single time you want to check your email. You want to log in once and have access to it. But combined with the Remember Me functionalities in the websites, it means the attacker can have up to 90 days or whenever the password's reset to continually access the environment. So I mentioned that they were using e-discovery to steal data. And e-discovery, for those of you that are not familiar, it's the process of identifying and delivering electronic information that can be used as evidence in legal cases. So it's a very thorough way to search through the contents of your organization's documents, emails. It allows you to search mailboxes, Microsoft Teams chats, SharePoint, the contents of OneNote files, Excel, and even Skype conversations. So what the attackers did was they created an e-discovery case. They then created a search, looked at a couple of the entries in their searches, and realized that they were getting the data that they wanted, and then they downloaded them all. So the first event entry that we see here is the search created event. So we get the query is recorded, we get the time that it was recorded, and we also get the case name that these query results are going to be stored within. In this particular case, APT35 was looking for the RSA seed files for the soft tokens. I'm sure nobody's ever emailed a new employee the soft token seed, but we've actually seen APT35 use this exact search on over 12 clients. This is very common for them. This is how they operate. But what we do notice that's missing from this event log entry is the client IP address. The only way we were able to determine that they were accessing the Security and Compliance and eDiscovery Center was by mapping the application GUID to the logon event, and we noticed that the Security and Compliance Center mapped to that GUID. Otherwise, we don't have an IP address to track all the attacker's activity. So once they started getting their search results in, they started clicking on a couple of them to see what they look like, and that generates a preview item rendered event. So anytime an individual object is rendered in the eDiscovery UI, it generates this preview item rendered event. Now, what's interesting to note is that it cannot render complex file types. So OneNote documents, Excel documents, and some Word documents cannot be rendered in the UI, but they still generate a corresponding account, or a corresponding event log entry. So we're going to see the object ID is going to reference the case name that this search came from, and then we're going to have the object name. So this could be the file name, it could be an email subject line, and then you're going to have the exchange locations. And this is an array of every location or every mailbox that contain this particular item. And this is in an effort to deduplicate the data that's being pulled back to the eDiscovery Center. But you can imagine if an email is sitting in a couple hundred mailboxes, that array can get quite large. And then it starts to exceed the 3,060 character limit of the unified audit log entry. And what that results in is a truncated event log entry and malformed JSON. So these events were getting dropped by the client SIM because they weren't being processed correctly, and we had to go to the raw logs within Office 365 to get them. And if we hadn't identified this, we would have likely missed potential items that the attacker had viewed, and from regulatory compliance, from a PII notification perspective, that's really important data to look for. Then we see the search export downloaded event. And this indicates that the attacker downloaded the results of their search. So you're going to get the search ID that maps back to the search that was used to create the results. But you're only going to get a notification that the download started. You're not going to get any notification that it completed. And this is done, the downloads are completed through a Microsoft Click Once application in Internet Explorer, and anecdotal testing has shown that it fails regularly during the downloads. And we actually observed this with the attackers. We would see 5, 6, 7 attempts to download the file, and then eventually it would work, or we presume it worked because there's no completion notification. And up until recently, the messages were delivered in a PST file, and then the SharePoint objects are downloaded individually to the file system. Now, to date, there's no way to determine the contents of this search. So if the attacker deletes their eDiscovery case when they're done, there's no logs that says these 12,000 emails were downloaded or these 5,000 files were downloaded. We don't even know the size of the download. So what we end up having to do is recreate the searches based on the parameters that the attacker used and then replicate that to determine what data was potentially exposed. So in the next step that the attackers did was they wanted to grant themselves access to high-value mailboxes. And they did this by executing the set mailbox permission command to grant their account full access to a handful of useful accounts within the environment, which allowed them to access contents of the mailboxes. And if we go back to what we were talking about with the mailbox audit logs, we'll know that only the folder bind is going to be recorded in these delegate access events, which means we have no idea what the attacker's looking at or what they're going back and doing. We just know that they've logged into the mailbox to look. So what was really fascinating about this case is that there was a high volume of data theft. They were able to complete their mission without leaving a lot of forensic artifacts locally on the devices. So traditional investigative methods would have only found that they were using Mimikatz to steal credentials. And if we had limited our analysis to host-based and network-based analysis, we would have never identified the high volume of data theft that occurred. So we're going to talk about a couple different types of access that happen in Office 365 that don't quite fit into the case studies we were just talking about. The first one is the Azure AD PowerShell commands. So unlike Exchange Online PowerShell, you cannot turn this off. And you cannot apply conditional access policies to it. So any user, even if they're unlicensed, so they don't have a mailbox assigned to their account, can log in using the Connect Azure AD commandlet, and then they can run the Get Azure AD user account or command to list out every account within the tenant. So this is really useful information if you're trying to start a password spray attack or if you're trying to find phishing targets within the environment. So one authenticated user can result in an attack happening a couple days later. And I think it was December of last year, we had about 50 organizations call us with this exact problem. They were all experiencing password spray attacks that were all tracked back to an initial authentication with the Azure AD PowerShell.
So another thing we want to talk about is OAuth abuse. And as both Josh and I have mentioned during this talk, the underlying authentication mechanism for Office 365 is OAuth, which is OAuth bearer tokens. So just little pieces of text that say this user can access these applications. Now, cloud service providers have been able to use this model to expand it to third-party applications. So G Suite, Office 365, Box, Dropbox, they all have what they'll usually call third-party application plugins. And the reasoning is, well, our users, they want to connect Salesforce directly to their mailbox so that they can be more productive and synergy and this and that. Now, once installed, these applications can access the user's data on their behalf at any time. And again, this makes sense. If I have my Salesforce integration in my mailbox, I want it to be always looking through my mailbox to generate new leads. And it's going to, of course, by design, bypass multi-factor requirements. And it's going to have access to this mailbox for at least 90 days, if not more. The only factor would be if you remove it or if the user changes their password. Now, as investigators, we can see this replicated in a few ways in the unified audit log. And we need to first understand exactly what an attacker is going to do to generate what we call OAuth abuse. So the attacker can first go to the Microsoft app portal and register a new app. Let's say they call it Windows Defender Email Virus Scanner. They then say this application needs access to Exchange Online, it needs access to SharePoint, it needs access to OneDrive, and it needs to have that access on an offline basis, meaning they need to be able to access the data not just when the user is logged in. They then generate what's called a consent link, and they send a phishing email to this victim. They say, hey, this is your IT department. We really need everyone to install the Windows Defender Email Virus Scanner application. Please click this link to do so. And one of the nice parts about this attack is that that phishing link, it doesn't go to a random domain that the attacker controls. It's not like a phishing page. It's actually the legitimate Microsoft Office 365 sign-in page, and it's what's called a consent link. So the victim will get to an official Microsoft page, which says really not that much. It says, hey, you're asking to install the Windows Defender Email Virus Scanner. It needs access to your email, to your SharePoint, and to your OneDrive. do you want to allow it? That's it. It doesn't tell you like the publisher. It doesn't give you any sort of URL. If the attacker chose to create a privacy policy for you, you can definitely view that. Now, in the unified audit log, we're going to see this in a couple of different ways. One of them is this operation called add service principal. If we remember back to that Azure sidetrack, the application the attacker created sits in their own tenant. This could even be done with an Outlook.com account. It would sit in the Outlook tenant. And then when the victim consents to that application, a service principal of that attacker application is created in their tenant. And that's what we're seeing being recorded. Now, the log event doesn't really tell us that much, but it does give investigators a key piece of information, and I've highlighted it there. It's called the callback address. So the attacker needs to have a server that sits and listens for those OAuth tokens, because that OAuth token is what you actually need to send back to the Microsoft API and access that user's data. So that URL is really interesting for us, because if, for example, the application is called the Windows Defender email scanner, but the callback URL is myevilsite.ru/callback, we're probably going to want to look into that as OAuth abuse. And in terms of controlling this, there's not too many options, unfortunately. If you are an E5 subscriber or you have cloud app security, there are a lot of cool things you can do with investigating the apps in your environment and trying to put in some limitations. But short of that, you basically have two options. You can turn on cloud applications, or you can turn them off. So what have we learned today? Hopefully quite a bit, but some of the key things that Josh and I want to make sure we all are on the same page about is make sure all your auditing options are on. Because I don't think we actually talked about this, but when you set up an Office 365 tenant, every single log, the unified audit log, the mailbox audit logs, the admin audit log, those are all off by default. Now, Microsoft has taken steps and put out communications that they're working on enabling this by default, but it hasn't yet happened, probably because of privacy concerns and the like. So make sure this is on in your tenant, especially with mailbox audit logs, because as Josh mentioned, those logs are stored in each mailbox separately, which means you actually need to iterate through all of your mailboxes and turn that on per mailbox. And then additional licensing means you're going to get more log sources. So if you have Azure AD Premium, you'll get those Azure AD sign-in events. You'll get what are called risk events, all tools that you as investigators and as defenders can use to keep your tenants safe. We also learned that authentication isn't necessarily as straightforward as we thought. You can choose where it happens. You can also choose how it happens. Legacy authentication is enabled by default, and that's something you should absolutely be turning off. If you find that you have a couple of executives maybe with like Blackberries that don't support it, you can keep it on, but you can, with Azure AD Premium, put controls on that with access control policies. And then events can be misleading and stored in different places. I think we talked about that. Now, in the last maybe 6 months, there's been a lot of efforts by Microsoft to standardize the unified audit log and put more stuff in there, and that's really awesome. There still are some events that we've seen can be misleading, but I'm pretty sure that all of that will be fixed eventually. And with legacy authentication, there have been communications that Microsoft will disable it by fall of 2020. So that's another thing to keep on the lookout for. And then I think the last important thing is just the attackers are becoming Office 365 experts. There's a lot of great documentation on Office 365, how to use it, how to maintain it. You know, this is a key area that Microsoft is focusing on. And just like you and your IT department and we as defenders are reading these documents, watching these videos, learning about Office 365, the attackers are doing the same exact thing. They're using all of these tools to their fullest potential to maintain access to Office 365 and complete their own missions. So that's all that we had. We still have about 4 minutes for questions. So if there's any questions, I encourage you to use the microphones in the aisles. And if not, thanks a lot.